So we have learned about matter. Matter is composed of atoms and they join together to form molecules, and that's what everything is made up of. You, me, the non-living environment, everything. So you used to be smaller than you are today, so you used to be composed of less matter. Where did the matter that you're made up of come from? Well, probably not a very big mystery. It comes from the food you eat. So in the last discussion, we talked about how organisms take in matter, nutrients from their environment, and then they convert it into living tissue. We didn't really get into the specifics, but that's what goes on. That really hasn't been very mysterious to people for very long. For plants, it was a little bit of a different story. So plants in the ground, well, it's pretty obvious to people that they grow, but the way that they grow, that escaped us for quite a while because plants don't consume like we do. They're autotrophs. They did not have a word for that in ancient times. They had no idea how photosynthesis worked or the fact that photosynthesis even existed. Now people understood perfectly well that flowers and plants, really they didn't care about flowers, they were trying to grow food. So plants and crops needed water to be able to grow. And they did also understand that plants need some sort of nutrients. They didn't really know exactly what those nutrients were, but long time ago people figured out that manure or charcoal ground up certain types of matter worked very good as fertilizers that helped plants grow. But they had no idea what was going on. Now those nutrients do help, but they're actually a really small part of the plant's growth and development. They're important, but they're a very small part. What plants do, you cannot see this, but they draw in carbon dioxide from the air, and then they absorb water from the ground. Now, how do living things what's the energy unit for living things? Well, it's the carbohydrate, right? CH2O, that's just the ratio. Well, this is what plants do. They take the carbon and the hydrogen and the oxygen from these two compounds, and they piece it together inside their cells. They borrow sunlight energy to be able to break those bonds apart and then assemble them. And then they give off that waste product, which is good for us, oxygen gas, right? So that is how a plant is able to gain mass. So there's a cycle going on here, right? The plant is pulling substance out of the air and from the water out of the ground, building into its own tissues. Now an organism could consume the plant and then take in that same matter, recycle it. The plant or the animal eventually dies, and decomposers and other processes can return all of this organic matter back into the soil that it can be used up for more plants, for more growth. And then animals do the opposite of what plants do. Instead of making carbohydrates by taking in CO2 and water, we take in carbohydrates, we eat them, and then when you breathe, when you exhale, it's carbon dioxide and water that are the waste products. And so we take in oxygen and carbohydrates, out comes CO2 and water. The exact opposite of what goes on with plants. So, get rid of this and we'll start this discussion. Here we go. So aside from the energy, the food energy for plants, they get it from light. For chemosynthetic organisms, they can start building carbohydrates from non-organic matter. We also need other compounds besides that. Unlike the one-way flow of energy, matter though is recycled. There is no manna that rains down from the heavens. That's an old idea. All the matter on Earth is recycled. We don't get any more, and we don't really lose any. Maybe it takes a long time to process it from one form to the other, but it's all recycled. The carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water that living things need passes through the air into the land, into the water, and amongst other living things. There are atoms and molecules in your body that were part of the living tissue of a plant, a dinosaur, an amoeba, a bacteria, many, many, many millions of years ago. So we call these biogeochemical cycles. Bio because it's life and living things take in all this matter. Geo because it's also interacting with the physical earth. Excuse me. So from my living cells, I give off carbon dioxide, water that can go into the atmosphere and then become part of the planet. And then chemical because, well, these are chemical changes going on. We're dealing with breaking the bonds of matter apart and redistributing them and using them. And that matter is used for chemical reactions. And when they are done, the matter goes back to the earth in a different form. So that's one of the hallmarks of chemical reactions. Even though here this is the reaction of photosynthesis, even though we have completely different and unique compounds that have very different properties, in the end, we don't have any extra materials here. Everything is conserved. You have to distribute the 6, so I have 12 oxygens there, and 6 here, so that's a total of 18. Well, 6 plus 12, 6 times 2, also 18. Boom. Everything is conserved perfectly. So, let's see here, so this is just an example of, we'll get into this in more detail, but this is the carbon cycle, right? Now, a lot of this is, we're showing the human effect of this, so we have fossil fuel emissions. Those really weren't part of the planet until only the last couple hundred years. But all this other stuff is true. Plants give off some CO2 into the air, so do animals naturally. That's reabsorbed by the plant, it gets absorbed into the soil. Carbon dioxide can be absorbed by the oceans, it is absorbed. It's used in there, also released. As material dies and decays, it releases those in different ways. So there's living things, and then the non-living things, both the air, the ground, and the water. So we'll do specific matter cycles: water, carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, and I think that's it. Maybe I'm forgetting one, but we'll see. So you need water to survive. Yeah. Water, we talked about its properties. It's the only compound that can be solid, liquid, and gas on Earth. So water very readily and very easily, constantly cycles through the air, the water, and within living things. You probably know what evaporation is, but a highly crucial form of evaporation is transpiration. And this is when plants release water vapor from their leaves. A tree, like a fairly tall tree, an oak tree or something like that, can absorb as much as 400 gallons of water in one single day. They can also release that much water in a single day. These are huge quantities. You think of a place like the Amazon rainforest. That's the wettest place on Earth. Its yearly rainfall is greater than anywhere else on our planet. But most of the Amazon rainforest is very far away from the coast. And there are no really gigantic lakes or anything in South America at all, let alone in the rainforest. Half of all the rain that falls over the Amazon the rain comes out of the sky, but it gets there in the first place from the trees, because there are trillions of trees in the Amazon rainforest. So like I said before, water goes between your body to the environment, to the ground, to the air and the water, all throughout, very readily. So water is not really a thing that we need to worry about running out of or anything like that. Now it's true that finding good, clean, sterile water can be a problem for us. Animals more or less kind of know what they're doing because they're just working with what they got. We tend to engineer our way into problems. We grow a lot of food, so we get a population boom, but then we stick all these people in places where it's pretty hard to find water. And so, there's problems there. But, here's just a map of the water cycle. You don't need to be told how the water cycle works, probably. One thing I'll say though with transpiration is there have been settlements by Viking people, explorers that have they go to a new area and they colonize it, and in order to develop pasture land or crop land, they have to clear all the trees out, right? Because you can't really farm inside a forest, and you can't have your animals grazing in a forest either. So they clear out the trees. And many times over this happened. They would cut down the trees, and then they couldn't grow crops because the rains would stop coming. They actually cut down so many trees that they got rid of the source of water vapor going into the air to give them moisture in the air, to give them rain eventually. The ground simply won't give up its water. The trees and plants need to extract that water out. So it's another thing that we have to be careful of. All right, a nutrient is any chemical that is necessary for an organism's metabolism, right? Or any kind of compound that an organism needs to live. Now, not all compounds are nutrients, right? Certain compounds are deadly or poisonous or just simply don't work for lots of organisms, whereas for others they do. We talked about koala bears in one discussion. They eat eucalyptus leaves and they get all the nutrients they need from that. Eucalyptus leaves, you couldn't live on them. In fact, they're poisonous actually. What nutrients do is they help you grow body tissues and they help you make energy. And that takes care of everything. All of the characteristics of living things, being able to grow, reproduce, adapt, get rid of waste, change over time. All of that can be done as long as you have energy. And that's what the nutrients do. Energy and raw materials, I should say too. So nutrients also pass not just from living things to other living things. You know, we think of it that way because all the food we eat is pretty much organic. Maybe it's, you know, if you buy an apple and it's not organic, it doesn't mean it's not an apple. It just means that they used man-made chemicals as a fertilizer to grow it or something. It's still, you know, the food you eat is organic, except for sometimes candy can actually be made out of petroleum products, which is technically organic, I guess. Okay, the carbon cycle, moving on. The life is carbon-based. It's the most important element inside living things, and we've unpacked that already. And carbon moves through the ecosystems in 4 primary ways. Photosynthesis, respiration, which is what animals and fungi and protists do. It's the opposite of photosynthesis. You take in oxygen and carbohydrates and give out carbon dioxide. Decomposition. Let me see here, sorry. Decomposition. Yeah, sorry. Decomposition is the third and final one. Those processes exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen. So that's one. Those are what the living things do. Volcanic activity and erosion can release carbon dioxide into the air. Now, this was always locked in place, not really part of any biogeochemical cycle on Earth until only a few hundred years ago, but the fossil fuels that we burn. Now, the problem with that is fossil fuels kind of get a bad rap. I'm very much in favor of alternative energy. I see it as the future, and I see it as a very positive thing. But I do defend fossil fuels. But one thing that is true, we have an entire planet, and before humans came along, the whole planet was in balance. It was in a state of equilibrium. Now, that state of equilibrium did change, but it would change over huge timescales, millions and millions of years. It would typically take for really radical changes to happen. But humans have caused seriously radical changes only in the last couple hundred years. So we think about a carbon cycle. Okay, so we got trees, they take in carbon dioxide and they release it too. We got animals. Oh, let's see if we can draw an animal here. There, dog. they take in carbon dioxide and release it to the oceans. They absorb carbon dioxide. They can also release it. Now, that was always in balance. There was X amount of carbon would go into the air, and then that same amount of carbon would be recycled again. So we never saw the levels of carbon dioxide fluctuate. Over extremely long time spans, it could. For example, before the dinosaurs were around, we think carbon dioxide levels were at least twice as high as what they are today, but they wouldn't change all that quickly, not by any means. But locked inside the Earth is billions and billions and billions and billions of tons, actually trillions of tons really, of locked in solid carbon. But it's not part of any cycle. That is until humans come along and they develop industrial ways of releasing this carbon dioxide. Okay, well, we have this gigantic system of, and we burn, the amount of carbon dioxide that goes into the air, it's many tens of billions of tons of the stuff. So it's huge. It's huge, huge, huge quantities. It's the equivalent of the weight of 3 Mount Everests, which is a lot. So anyways, we're now changing this cycle. We're releasing these huge quantities, but the only way the carbon can get back in is being absorbed by the oceans or the plants, right? Well, they were already at equilibrium. So the plants in the oceans cannot keep up with the amount of extra carbon that we're pumping out. We have figured out that plants and oceans have been able to absorb about half of the carbon, that extra carbon that we dump out, but that still leaves a huge quantity. In 1850, the percentage of our atmosphere that was carbon dioxide was around 0.024, shouldn't have put that there, around 0.024%. That's not very high. Whereas today, 2018, it is pretty much 0.04%. Now, yes, these are really small values, but 0.4 is, we've almost doubled it. When we get to 0.48, we will have doubled it. So, yeah, they're small numbers, but we've almost doubled it. And it's only been 150 years. Earth has been at balance with this stuff for hundreds of millions or billions of years. So, yeah, we do have the power to change things. Anyways, and that's the last part here. Human activity has greatly altered this cycle, whereas the other cycles, human activity doesn't really alter it, not exactly. And if it does, nowhere near at the level we can do with the carbon cycle. So, water is always in the form of water. That's it. When it's in you, it's water. When it's in the ground, it's water. In the air, it's water. But carbon attaches to other atoms and molecules to change its form. So when it's in the air, it's carbon dioxide. In living things, the carbon dioxide from the air gets put into glucose and starches and glycogen and calcium carbonate in skeletons, also in seashells, because carbon dioxide is also in the water. And so animals like, if you've ever tried to have a fish tank where you have like crabs or corals or something like that, it's really difficult to do. And one of the things is you have to have what's called live rock in there. There are certain rocks and minerals you have to have in your fish tank that slowly dissolve their carbon out into the water, because the crabs or whatever other animals that have shells need to absorb the carbon dioxide, and they will grow their shells with that. Without it, their shells can't grow, or their shells become weak. Certain rocks have carbon, but mostly it's fossil fuels, and then dead organisms as well. Release carbon into the soil that bacteria and plants can use. And then simply dissolved carbon dioxide is what's in the water. Plants that grow in the water like kelp use that carbon dioxide. So here are kind of all of those things. Now, if we wanted to put it into perspective, the arrow coming off of the human activity would probably be just about the biggest arrow. If I've heard people talk about, or it's been said that like volcanic activity can dwarf human activity. Like, yeah, people burn fossil fuels, but we're one big volcanic eruption away from throwing that off. Well, that's completely not true. It's very much not true. Right now we have these forest fires going on in California, for example. These are the largest forest fires that have ever happened in the state of California. And they've been burning for weeks. But even those fires, they're not going to produce anything like the amount of carbon dioxide that humanity produces. To give you an idea, Mount St. Helens, so that was the largest eruption that has taken place in many, many, many decades, maybe even several centuries. And it released a lot of carbon dioxide, but in order for volcanic eruptions to match human output of carbon dioxide, an eruption equivalent to Mount St. Helens would have to occur every third day for an entire year, and then it would match the CO2 that we can make every year. Just goes to show how much of the stuff we can make. All right, onto the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is crucial because it is part of your DNA. So with a limited amount of nitrogen, and it always starts with plants because plants are the base of the food chain. If the plants don't have enough nitrogen, their cells can't divide fast enough, and dividing cells is what makes something grow. As you grow, you become more numerous in cells. So without that, that is what limits plant growth. And nitrogen comes in 4 different forms. Nitrogen gas, which is in the air. Now, most of air is nitrogen. It's about 78% of our atmosphere. But neither you or I or plants or fungi or anything can directly use that nitrogen except for one special class of bacteria. So every time you breathe, you're breathing mostly nitrogen, but it's not considered a nutrient that way because it cannot enter your cells. Ammonia is another one. When organisms die and decay, they release ammonia. Ammonia smells absolutely terrible. So if you've ever stumbled upon a dead animal, a lot of what makes it stink is ammonia. What are called nitrates, and then nitrites, which are they're very similar. So we'll get to the way the nitrogen cycle starts is with these bacteria that can pull nitrogen out of the air, because that's where the nitrogen is so ubiquitous. So this process is, now these bacteria, many of them have a symbiotic relationship with certain types of plants, and the bacteria lives inside the root of the plants, and the bacteria absorb the nitrogen, convert it into ammonia, and then the plants can absorb that solid ammonia. Well, it's technically a liquid, but the plants can then absorb that and use it. They can't use it as nitrogen, but they can, as ammonia. That process is called nitrogen fixation, and that's where all the nitrogen in living things gets its start from, or most of it. So the plant can build amino acids. Those are the building blocks of proteins. And they can also put it in their DNA. But it's also a very important part of proteins as well. Now your body is made of a huge portion of proteins. So actually when I said DNA dividing, that's not the most important factor. It's actually the proteins, because proteins have so many different functions in our bodies. They are the enzymes and the mechanical molecular mechanisms that drive your metabolism and everything. And then us consumers, well, without the plants, we can't get a steady supply of nitrogen. Now, for the longest time, and this was talked about in the very first discussion we did when I went over the history of science, Earth's population was pretty much flat all the way until the very end of around the middle of the 1800s was the first time the world population ever reached 1 billion people, and it's just gone up and up and up and up ever since then. We've doubled the population, let me think, I think 4 times since then. We went from 1 billion to 2 billion, 2 to 4, well, no, so it wouldn't be that many times, but anyways, you get the idea. The most significant reason for this happening is that in the early 1900s, we figured out how to make liquid nitrogen fertilizers. So for the first time ever, we always had to rely on the earth and the soil and crop rotation and rain to get our plants to grow. But the earth can only do so much of that because it's kind of part of this equilibrium thing, right? Well, this guy, his name was Fritz Haber. He went on to create chemical weapons during World War II for the Germans. So he was kind of a bad guy, but he is almost solely responsible for the existence of around 6 billion people. Because Earth's population at the time of him was 1.6 billion. Now it's 7.5 billion. So 6 billion people exist because of this guy. He figured out how to make liquid nitrogen fertilizers, and right after that process, all of a sudden we could grow huge amounts of food in the exact same area. I'm just going to reiterate something from that discussion. We grow 300% more food on Earth than we did 100 years ago, but we've only developed 12% more farmland. So we're growing 3 times the amount of food with virtually the same amount of land. Pretty awesome. We're not done with the nitrogen cycle yet, though. When organisms die, decomposers and plants and things can absorb the ammonia that they're made of. Now, there's another class of bacteria that can convert nitrates into nitrogen gas, and that's called denitrification. So that replenishes nitrogen back into the atmosphere because there aren't any geological processes that make nitrogen gas. Volcanoes, when they erupt, they don't spew any nitrogen gas. When organisms respirate, or when trees respirate, which means just to give off gases, they don't release nitrogen gas. So this denitrification process is really crucial. And then weirdly, nitrates also make their way into soil from lightning. When lightning, a lightning bolt has so much heat and energy that when the lightning bolt zaps the atmosphere, 99% of our atmosphere is nitrogen gas and oxygen gas. Well, that's what nitrates are made from, is nitrogen and oxygen. So the lightning bolt has so much energy that it breaks apart the nitrogen and the oxygen molecules from themselves and then attaches them together. Really kind of an interesting process. So here's that process kind of going on. How much of the nitrates is that responsible for? I don't know, but there we go. So we can see decomposition in many different forms creates the ammonia. So bacteria can release that back into the air. The uptake by plants is done from the ammonia that gets into its soil from decomposition, but also from fixation. And then us, so the goat here, which we could be the goat for all we care, you can see that there's no release of nitrogen. They can only absorb or take the nitrogen in from their environment. I guess when they die, they do put nitrogen back into the system. All right, phosphorus. Why is it important? It's a crucial component of your DNA, which all living things have. But phosphorus is more rare than the other elements. And the other thing that kind of stinks about phosphorus is it never enters the atmosphere as a gas. So if something can enter the atmosphere, it can spread around the globe very quickly and become evenly distributed. But phosphorus does not do that. Instead, most phosphorus is locked inside of minerals inside rocks that we call phosphate, which is phosphorus bonded to some other elements. What plants do is in the soil is, when you pick up soil, it's got texture to it, but a large amount of the minerals, the solid material of soil, is so microscopic that you can't really detect it. So it's just much, much, much smaller. But it's small enough that plants can actually absorb it. It also gets dissolved in water. So as the plants absorb water, the water has phosphorus mixed in with it. It might also have carbon dioxide and ammonia mixed in with the water. And so in that form, the phosphorus is broken down into a small enough form that it can be processed. And then, like the nitrogen, consumers rely on the producers for their phosphorus, because we don't eat rocks and minerals, or at least I don't. So there's no atmosphere in this process, but it just simply is released. Now water has the ability to erode, eat away at rock, because water is just, if you had pure water, no impurities whatsoever, it's totally neutral, but water absorbs carbon dioxide, which makes carbonic acid, which makes it just a little bit acidic. So it does a very good job at getting that phosphorus absorbed, not absorbed, but dissolved into incredibly tiny molecules that can be absorbed. So this is kind of interesting. This is a map showing the concentration of chlorophyll in the oceans. Now, chlorophyll is the molecule that photosynthetic organisms use to absorb sunlight, right? So the more chlorophyll there is, the more producers there are. Orange is where it's really highly concentrated. Blue is where there's pretty much none of it. Green is where there's a lot, but not as much as orange. And what we see here is all of the chlorophyll is located just off the coasts of continents. The reason for that is, and if we look at Alaska, around Russia, same thing. It's all floating right next to the continents. Now the reason for that is, so here it is globally, nowhere, when you get far away from land, there's virtually none of it at all. That's because, go back to this picture. The photosynthesizers, they need phosphorus. They can get all the other things from the water because there's oxygen, carbon dioxide, and then obviously water everywhere, and there's nitrogen in the form of decomposition all around in those oceans. They cannot get the phosphorus. That can only be thrown into the waters by dissolving away from solid rocks on land. So rivers are very good at distributing it, but also just simply the erosion of the rocks around land dumps that phosphorus onto our oceans, and it doesn't make it really all that far, but that's where we see all of the chlorophyll at. So in this map, for example, this is the habitats for whales that have been observed. Their feeding areas, if you look, are right along the coasts of Antarctica, right along the coasts of the very upper parts of North America, and way up in northern Europe. Well, that's exactly where the biggest concentrations of photosynthesizers are, which is also where the biggest concentrations of phosphorus is. So these things are really important. Right, I think we're getting to the end here. An ecosystem, so what determines if an ecosystem has lots and lots of life and many different species, like lots of biodiversity we call it, versus only a few different kinds of species and not much? Well, part of it is the weather. If there isn't enough water, then that's going to be one of the most crucial factors. But another is limiting nutrients. Some places that have very good climates that you could think could support lots of different kinds of life are pretty sterile, or if not sterile, yeah, there's lots of things there, but there's just not very much diversity. And that's usually because of a lack of nutrients. So primary productivity in an ecosystem is the rate at which producers make organic matter, or it's the rate at which biomass grows in the producers. Remember, they are the things that support the entire rest of the food chain, or the food web, are the producers. So if they're low, everything else has to be low. Besides sunlight and water, the nutrients are a really crucial factor. If one nutrient is in short supply, ecologists call it the limiting nutrient. So farmers have known about this forever. So this is why we add fertilizers to the soil. The most common thing that the fertilizers are adding are phosphorus and nitrogen, because the nitrogen, there's a very special process that gets it into the soil. But if you just grind up, like make fish paste or bone meal or manure or guano, which is like bat or bird droppings, that makes a pretty decent fertilizer. Now we make chemical ones. And those things all also have phosphorus in them as well. So we can, to illustrate, this will illustrate the phosphorus example pretty well. But let's think about a place that's fairly surprising where the soil is really incredibly fertile, and that would be Hawaii. The Hawaiian Islands they have good climate, but it's just a tiny little island. You wouldn't think there'd be enough activity, even without humans or anything, you wouldn't think there'd be enough natural activity there to support all that much. But the biodiversity, the sheer number of different kinds of plant and insect and other animal species on Hawaii is staggering, considering how tiny of a landmass it is. Now, why is it like that? Because if we would look at that map, Hawaii sits in the middle of the ocean, so it's very far away from that phosphorus and all that. Well, it's actually the fact that Hawaii is a volcano, or it's a series of volcanic islands that does that for it. We all know about Pompeii, right? The city that was completely destroyed and buried in ash from the volcano Vesuvius. Why were people living next to that volcano? Like, people had to have known that they were dangerous. Well, because by living near it, they were living next to incredibly rich soils, and they were able to grow more food there than anywhere else. So it was economically, it made economic sense to do that. The reason that is because, take the phosphorus, for example. That gets eroded out of rocks and distributed around. Well, erosion is a really slow process. What's a much quicker process is intermittent or random volcanic eruptions. They don't have to be big volcanic eruptions, even little ones. What that does is it basically sprinkles volcanic material all over, and then that stuff gets blanketed down and deposited. Well, because volcanoes grab material from inside the Earth, the interior of Earth it is a very rich and thorough mixture of everything you can imagine, really. All the vitamins and minerals and nutrients that we haven't talked about, like molybdenum is something that your bodies need. Iron is something that our bodies need. It's not a nutrient, but it's one of those things. All the different kinds of vitamins, right? That stuff is mixed much more concentrated below. So these volcanoes are constantly depositing that. It's like they're sprinkling multivitamins all over the place all the time. So it becomes hugely, hugely productive. Something just worth talking about. Now that we use these chemical fertilizers, and we use so much of them, the population has just soared. The problem is that, so the river in town, right, the Big Sioux River, it's disgusting. It's gross. It's always chock full from, after the snow melts, from April, May, and part of June. The water's fairly clear. I actually kayak on that river whenever I can. And in those months, it's nice. The water's clear. There's not a lot of weeds and stuff in it. But after that, it gets so bad. And sometimes we can get like this pond scum and things like that growing in it. It's just gross. Why is that there? Well, I promise you, can guarantee that that problem didn't exist before we moved into this area. What happens is, farmers, they spray fertilizers containing lots of nitrogen on their crops. Farmers need to be able to grow food to feed people. And they need a way to make a living and make money so they can raise their children, send them to college, do this, do that. It's for the best, it's in the best interest of us. But that nitrogen gets into the water, and now all of a sudden the water is fertilized. So plants just, boom, it's called an algae bloom. But algae blooms are not healthy for water ecosystems, because what happens is, remember, the river ecosystem has been shaped over hundreds of thousands of years. Rivers don't exist as long as other features do. But they get to a balancing point, and it takes them a long time, and they maintain it for hundreds of thousands of years. But when humans come along, it disrupts it. So this unbelievable growth of plants that occurs in and this happens in Lake Pelican too, because Lake Pelican, the water doesn't flow in or out, it just sits there. This huge boom of plant matter occurs, okay? Well, then what ends up happening is the plants, they die naturally. It's part of what goes on. Well, then bacteria and things gorge on the plants. And I think in one lecture I told you how rapidly bacteria can multiply through binary fission. It's incredible. Very quickly, all of this excess algae is consumed and decomposed. But those bacteria, because they're consumers, what do? They take in oxygen, right? The lake, all the water, and this happens in rivers too, but it's much worse in lakes. All of the oxygen in the water, all the free dissolved oxygen, gets taken up, so the lake dies. They've had to do this at Lake Pelican before. They do a total kill. They kill every single fish and everything in the entire lake. They have to sterilize it because it's just been thrown so out of whack that it's only going to get worse. There's going to be more decomposition of all think about how many fish must live in a big lake like Compesco or Pelican. It's got to be maybe in the millions. It probably is. So think of all the decay and rot and just grossness and disease that would be spread if those organisms were all killed. So these algae blooms they're a pretty bad story. It can also sterilize the oceans. The Mississippi River, which drains about a third of the United States, think of all the nitrogen that gets carried out there. There are actually dead spots in the Gulf of Mexico where pretty much nothing can live there. There's too much nitrogen in it, and it's just been sterilized. So think of how big of an ecosystem the middle of the Gulf of Mexico is. So, I don't know, we gotta figure something out. We got all these people, we need to feed them, but we can't just kill the rest of the environment so there can be people. But that's all we gotta talk about today.